Tell me who will drive those tractors when they're gone? Who'll lead the horses out at early morning dawn? Who'll feed the world and carry on when the young farmers and ranchers, they're long gone? Tell me we don't need you farmers anymore. Well, let's go downtown and get our food at the grocery store.
Hi, my name is Sam Nachtigall. I'm Emily Nachtigall's dad. I farm in South Dakota in the United States with Emily's uncle. We farm 1,600 acres of mainly corn and soybeans, sometimes wheat. Today we're harvesting corn. The corn that we have here is primarily is feed grain corn. It's fed to cattle, hogs, poultry. This field is dried down to around 13 to 15% moisture. And what we do here, it's all mechanized farming. In the spring when we planted, we had a 16-row planter, and what we do is no-till farming. We don't do any tillage at all. And the planter comes through. You can, the crop prior to this was corn, so we had corn on corn. And if you look closely at the ground, last year's corn was planted here, and then this year we split in between the row and then planted corn here. In our area, moisture is the most limiting factor for having a good harvest. In our state, or in our area, we average probably less than 30 inches of moisture per year. So by no-till farming, we conserve the moisture, because if you till the ground, you dry that portion of the ground out. And also, we think that, or we know that the no-till farming limits things like water erosion and also wind erosion. If you have all this cover on the ground, when it rains, the raindrops are, the energy is taken out of them by hitting the old plant growth, and then the water infiltrates better because of the decaying roots. Also the earthworms help by creating tunnels, and so we have no tillage on our farm. This is one of our tools. This piece of equipment is called a grain cart. It'll go next to our harvester or a combine, and the auger will come out from the combine. It'll drop into this big box that'll hold 1,100 bushels of corn. And then from there, we can bring the corn out of the field to the edge of the field, where we dump it into a truck. This is what we call a straight truck, and then we commonly have semis that have 2 compartments in the trailer. And from there, it's hauled to a storage facility, either a grain bin on the farm to where it's stored, to where we can sell it later, or it's hauled directly to what we call the grain elevator, and there it's it's hauled to maybe a terminal, to where it's put on trains, hauled to the coast, exported. A lot of our corn goes to China, Japan, Egypt, those kind of countries, along with our wheat and soybeans. Okay, now we're in the grain cart, going next to the combine, and he's unloading. May be hard to see. I'll back up a little bit. Now you can see the corn going into the cart. This way the harvester the combine doesn't have to stop. It can keep going continuous while he unloads, keeps combining. We're able to get more done. Our harvester is able to do about 100 acres, 100 to 160 acres a day, depending if we can keep the corn away from it, get it hauled away. This field will be averaging about 140 bushel. We had a relatively dry year this year. In a good year, we would have about 150 to 200 bushel corn, and when moisture limits us, we can have anywhere from 0 to 70 on poor years. The corn also can be harvested where the whole plant is chopped off. It's done a little bit before this, where the plant is still relatively green, and it's put in a big pile and packed, and then it's called corn silage, where it's fed to cattle. And also it could be, some farmers will take wet corn, and then it's put into a pile and then fed to livestock. But in order to ship it, or in order to store it for a long time, it has to be down to about 15% or less moisture. Here we are at the front end of the harvester, what we commonly call combine, so harvester or combine. This is the corn head, and what happens here is when this is turned on, there's two rotors in here that grab the corn and pull it down, and then there's two bars in there that once the ear of corn hits that bar, it's kicked cleanly off, and then the auger runs it into the combine, into the gathering chains, and then into the gathering chains there's a grate that has holes in it, and inside there's a rotor. And so the ear of corn comes in, hits the rotor, goes in, and then the kernel of corn itself is brushed off the cob. And then we have a fan in the combine. And so all the shaft is blown out. The heavier kernel of corn drops through. And we also have what we call sieve. So that the light stuff is blown off, the heavy kernel of corn drops onto the sieve and falls through down into an auger and goes into the tank. And then the bigger stuff, like the corn cob, is not allowed, or most of it is not allowed to fall through the sieve, and then is taken through the back of the combine and dumped back into the field. Okay, now we're in the harvester. As you can see, we call the snouts go in between the rows. That corn hits the rotors in there that's pulled down, and you can see the ears popping off. If you look at the corn head now, you can see how the little blades, the lower turning, and then the chains that gather the corn in and then run it into the auger. Here are some of the controls in the combine. Almost everything is run by what we call the joystick here. Here I can lift the head up, let it down. If I hit this button, I unload the corn, or I let the auger out to dump into a truck or the grain cart. Here's my monitor. Tells me that currently I'm going 4.7 mile an hour, 93 bushel corn in this area, and that'll always adjust. Here we're going through a low spot, so it'll go about down to 0 before we get into some better corn. So this particular unit, our harvester, we bought used a couple years ago. It only had like 200 hours that it had been run, and the cost of the machine was right at $190,000. The corn head cost about another $25,000, and then our soybean head costs like $70,000. So all in particular that harvest our grains runs us close to about $300,000. In the distance, you can see that our local grain elevator, where in the town of Platte, where the corn, wheat, and soybean goes. Sometimes we'll travel up to 100 miles to maybe go to a terminal to where the rail system is, real giant elevators. Our elevator here doesn't have rail service, so it's all trucked out and hauled about 100 miles to the nearest railroad. Going back to our farming practices, because we're no-till farming, we really rely heavily on herbicides. In the spring, we'll put on what we call a pre-plant herbicide before the corn is planted, and that'll control certain broadleaves and grasses. And then later on, as the corn emerges and gets so high, and the next flush of weeds start to come, we'll use a glyphosate herbicide, and we'll combine it with another herbicide to give us a broad spectrum and to try to reduce resistance to certain herbicides. So if you have a couple different herbicides mixed in, then you limit the chance of having herbicide-resistant weeds. Also, our fertilizer is put down. Our fertilizer is put down with our planter. There's tubes with liquid. In fact, on this tractor is what we use to plant with. So we have the tank on front, and then with pumps that goes through small tubes and is put down with the seed as we plant. Also, for our nitrogen herbicide, we'll either spread that on dry or we can go with liquid, a liquid form of nitrogen also.
And get your cattle off, oh, don't you ranchers know that it was made for the buffalo? So tell me, who will drive those tractors when they're gone? Who'll lead the horses out at early morning dawn? Who'll feed the world and carry on when the young farmers and ranchers, they're long gone? Oh, tell me, who will drive those tractors when they're gone? Who'll lead the horses out at early morning dawn? Who'll feed the world and